Have you ever wanted to interact with your dataset more directly? Well, look no further than the DataEditR package. This package allows you to load your dataset into a R-Shiny window, which gives you the ability to interact with it more directly, the same way you would with an Excel spreadsheet. So you can do some editing functions such as editing your column headers, adding columns, removing rows, and editing specific cells. There are a few other functionalities in this package, so we'll go ahead and dive deep into it. I do want to give a shout out to Dylan Hamill, who is the developer of this package. Dylan Hamill is a student, a PhD student actually, at the Australian National University, and he's the one that developed this package, so many props to him. I will leave a link to his GitHub so that you can check it out in the description. So let's get started. Getting started is fairly simple. We're going to start off by installing the DataEditR package using the install.packages function. Now you could also install the development version of DataEditR. I will say that this is a package that is far from complete and far from finished. There are still some bugs that need to be fixed, so it might be in your best interest to download the development version as well of the DataEditR instead of the regular one, because I know Dylan is making some updates to it every now and then. I've checked the GitHub. So you could do so by loading in the DevTools library and then using the install GitHub function to load up to install the specific development version of DataEditR. Last but not least, you will need to install Dylan Hamill's fork of R hands-on table. So this is a separate package that the DataEditR package relies on. So you'll install it the same way you would with the development version of DataEditR. After doing so, you're going to have to load in your libraries. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And now we're getting ready to move on to the next stage. So in this package, we only need to be concerned with one function, and that's the DataEdit function. This is the function that's going to allow us to load our dataset into the Shiny window. Now, if you were to run this function without using any parameters inside, it would load up a Shiny window for you. Now, there's a couple of functionalities that we will be exploring in here very shortly, but I did want to walk you through some other stuff as well. Now, by default, the Shiny window is loaded in the dialog. So whenever you would run this function, it would load the data into a dialog. Now there are other viewing options that you can get. You can actually load your data in the viewer pane. So if you were to pass in the viewer parameter and set it equal to viewer, your data will load into the viewer pane as here. If you click on done, that should actually end it. And then you can also load it in your web browser as well by setting the viewer parameter equal to browser. So if we were to run this function, it would load up in your default web browser and you can navigate from it using the web browser. Now, of course, you can copy your local host address and paste it into a different web browser. So let's say you wanted to do it from Chrome. So what you could do is you could just go ahead and copy your local host. And if you were to paste it in here, you could actually use it from Chrome as well. So in order to just close out of this, you're going to have to click on the Done button, the screen dims, and then you're going to have to click on the Close button as well. You can actually create a table yourself by setting the number of rows and columns. So by default, if we were to look at the DataEdit function, it's going to load up 10 rows and 10 columns. We can actually set the number of rows and columns by passing in a vector, with the first argument being the number of rows and the second argument being the number of columns. So if we were to run that, it should give you 5 rows and 10 columns. Also, you can set up certain columns. So let's say you know that you want to create 4 columns. So you can pass it in as a vector and pass in your columns as strings. So as you can see, we're creating 4 columns: first, last, job, and company. So if we were to run this line, it's going to create 4 columns for you as specified in the parameter. Okay, I think now it's a good time to really explore the Shiny window and looking at the functionalities of this package. So we're going to go ahead and type in the DataEdit function and run it. Now I will give you a fair warning and let you know that some of this functionalities of these buttons don't work effectively. Sometimes they do give errors. This is a package that's still in a development phase, so some of these functionalities might be working differently and not as intended, but there are constant updates and constant fixes being made to it. So hopefully we'll be able to come up with a final version of this package to use. So looking at the main window, I just wanted to bring your attention to some of the main parts. You can actually upload a data file using the Browse button. So if you were to click on the Browse button, it will allow you to upload a CSV file. Now you can upload other files as well with a different format, but I'll get more into that later because the default is actually a CSV. So if you load in like the iris dataset, you will see that it loads in just fine. Right here, you can actually select the columns. Now you can select the columns by clicking on them. If they turn green, that means that's going to be the selected column. And if it's red, that means it won't be selected. So let's say we want to select the first two columns and then we click on close. It should select those two columns. You have another option of filtering your rows. We'll get into that. As we move forward. The synchronize button is whenever you make changes, you want to have your changes synchronized. So you will have to click on this button every time you make a change or every time you make a set of changes that you want applied. I know it's not very convenient, but that's what we have to do. We have to click on it so that it's synchronized. You can save your selection to the file, or you can save your whole data set to the file. So clicking on either one of these is going to save it to a CSV file for you. Now the problem here is after we hit on the synchronize, it only shows us the two columns. The other three columns have disappeared. And this is one of the shortcomings of this package, is that once you synchronize those changes in filtering the columns are going to be gone and you can't get them back. So let's go ahead and try and just reload the data in here. And then let's say we wanted to select maybe this column, and this column right here. Now, if we try to click on the synchronize button, it gives us an error. And this is one of the common problems with this package, but I believe that there are some fixes hopefully in the making that can actually fix this functionality of the package. So that's just me showing you some of the downsides of this package and some of the things you need to be aware of. So when it comes to like filtering columns and selecting columns, you're probably better off using just R code, using maybe like the select function from dplyr to select the columns that you want to consider. To test out the filtering function, let's go ahead and select maybe a column. So let's say we want to set the species equal to Setosa. Now do keep in mind that you have to click in here and then click on add filter and then click close, and then this should select all the Setosa for you. If you try to unfilter, you do have to click on the remove the filters and then just click on close, and then now the filter is removed. I wouldn't personally spend too much time with these functionalities. They're still in the making, so they're not 100% perfect. So I would say do all of the column selecting and column selecting and the column filtering just from your code in dplyr. I think those are some pretty powerful functions that you can use. So this is kind of in that stage of a development, so it can give you some quirks. Okay, so one of the cool things though you can do here is that you can actually edit the column headers. So let's say you want to change this into, for example, sepal L, for example, and maybe you can change this into like sepal W. So you can actually change the column headers. You can also change the width of the columns by simply hovering your cursor over the column border, and then you can just simply drag your mouse and it will widen the columns for you. This is more for viewing purposes. It's not necessarily going to affect your data set when you print this out. You can actually change specific values. So you can go in here and you can recode values. So you could say, for example, 3.2 over here, and then you could say 7.8 over there. If you try to insert something that's not a number, so let's say we try to insert text, for example, it's going to go ahead and create a null value for you. It's going to create an NA because this is expecting to take a number. So we're going to go ahead and have to enter a number. So let's say we just set it to 8. And then, you could make a couple of other changes as well. So if you were, for example, to right click, you can actually insert a row. So you can insert rows and you can actually insert columns in specific positions. So let's say you want to add a row above. So we can add a row over here, and then we can give it new dimensions. Let's just say 1, 2, 3, 4. And then let's say we want to call this, for example, Setosa as well. So that can do it for us as well. And then we can actually go ahead and create a new column. We can right click and then click on a column over here, and it creates a new column for us. And let's just call this, cool flower. And then basically you can just put in whatever value you want. You can set this to a string, or you can even set this to a number as well. Since it's not really defined, you can set it to the way you want it to be. You can even go as far as copying values and dragging them. So this is a functionality you might be aware of in Excel where you can select multiple cells in here. So I'm going to hold down the Shift key and press my right key. And then we can actually hover over the bottom right corner, click and hold, and then drag all the way. And what it should do is it should actually copy those values for you. So that's one of the functionalities it can do in the data edit window over here. So that's some of the functionalities it can do. Now, of course, if you want to save these changes, you can go ahead and just click on synchronize over here. And then if you're to click on done, you can see that your data set has been printed out. And as you can see, if we were to scroll through our data set, you can see that the new column has been created, and you can see that the new values that we've created have been adjusted with the new column headers. So you will have to hit the synchronize button to make your changes, but that's how you can make your changes. If you wanted to store this in an object, you can obviously set the data edit function to be stored in an object, and then in that case all the changes you make will be stored in that object, and then you can go ahead and do some further manipulations with that data set, like filtering the rows, filtering columns, selecting columns, etc. So that's some of the main functionality of this window. Just a few more other things that I did want to talk about in terms of the window over here. Now, when it comes to the window, and let's go ahead and just load up the data set one more time. There is the undo and redo functions actually don't work for whatever reason. So that's something to be aware of whenever you're working with this data. You can also go as far as aligning your data, so you can put it in the center of your cell or to the right. And then you can actually just make some adjustments to it, whether you want to put the value in the top or the middle of the cell or the bottom of the cell. So let's say if we were to try and, for example, expand one of the rows, for example, over here, and then set the alignment equal to center, you can actually center that. It centers that whole thing for you. But let's say you want to center the entire column. So you just select the column by clicking the header and then right-clicking over here, and then you could do the alignment and then just do like a center, and it should center everything for you just like that. So unfortunately you cannot do we cannot do the undo or redo, which comes as a big bummer, because especially if you make changes and you want to undo them, you can't necessarily do that. So those were some of the functionalities of the window itself. It does have some of its shortcomings, but I do know that this package is currently being worked on, so hopefully some of those fixes can be implemented. So right now what I want to do is I want to take you into some of the parameters that you can pass into the data edit function, which can really increase the usability of this package for you. Okay, for the next set of explanations here, I will be referring to the empty cars dataset. This is a dataset that includes 32 automobiles from the 1970s, with a bunch of columns about describing the cars, such as their miles per gallon and number of cylinders and so on and so forth. So we want to focus on the parameters of the data edit function, and there are quite a lot of parameters that can be pretty useful. One of the first parameters is the call bind parameter. This gives you the ability to add a column to your data set. So if we were to load in the data edit function just using the empty cars argument, what we're going to see here is the empty cars data set with the name of the cars as the rows and then a bunch of columns in here. So this is just to give you an idea of what the data set looks like. And of course, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you can see that it is 32 observations. So let's go ahead and test out the call bind function and see what it does. And over here, what I'm doing over here is you're setting the call bind parameter equal to a list, and then this right here would be the column name that we're going to use. So in this case, the column name is the car name, and we're going to set it equal to the row names of empty cars, which would just be the name of the cars. So if we were to run this function, what we notice here is that we have a new column binded to our data set, which has a list of the car names. Cool. If you wanted to pass in other columns as well, you can simply do so by passing in more arguments into the list function. So you can type in another column, call it test column, and then set it, for example, equal to 0. And then if you were to run this, it should create another column for you as well. Okay. Now, Another function is the column edit function over here. What this does is it allows the user to add columns or not. So if it's set equal to true, which is the default value, it allows the user to add or remove columns. But if it's set to false, it will not allow them to do so. So if we were to run this and then we try to right click, you'll notice that there is no longer an option to insert a column or delete a column. Okay, so another function here that's pretty cool, or another parameter that's really cool, is the column options. So this gives you the ability to create columns that accept specific values. So there are 4 column options that you can select from. You can either select from a drop-down menu, a date, a checkbox, or a password. So in this instance, let's say we wanted to create a new column and add it to our data set called car color, and we want this column to be a drop down that would only contain specific colors such as red, blue, and yellow. So what we do is we set the column options parameter equal to a list where we pass in the column name, which is car color, and we're going to give it a vector of the values that we want to use as part of our drop down. So if we were to run this function over here, you're going to notice that there's a new column called car color. And if you notice there's an arrow over here, and if you click on it, you can actually set the values. So we can set this one to red, and we can set this one to blue, maybe set this one to red, and set this one to yellow. And then if we were to click on done and run this, one of the things you may notice in here is that, oh, I do have to actually synchronize that. So that's another example to show you that you need to synchronize. So let's just set that to red, blue, and let's set this to yellow. You do have to synchronize and then click on done. And then one thing you're going to notice here is that it actually leaves all the other values empty, which I think was like the intended effect over here. We didn't select those values from the drop down, so these are left empty, but the ones that we selected are going to be chosen over here. Okay, another example of the column options is the date. So let's say you want to create a date column. So for example, let's say we want to create a date column called date manufactured. So we're going to pass in a list where we specify the date manufactured column equal to date. So in order to specify the date type, you just have to type in a string of date. And if we were to run this, what it's going to do is it's going to create a column for us. And then you can actually select a date from here. This is very similar to like the date pop-up that you would see online when you're filling out forms. Now, the problem here is, if you want to select the year, it only gives you a certain window of years that you can pick from. So like if you go to 2012, then you can go and see the more previous years. So that's how you can get to some of the previous years. Or you could just simply type in a year. So let's say you want to go back to the 1700s. Then if you wanted to go and select the year from there, you can actually see a further year selection from there. So if we were to go ahead and synchronize and run that, we can notice that the value has been filled in. Another column option is the checkbox column. So this is more of like a true or false. So let's say we want to create a column to see if the car is a cool car. So we're going to create a column called cool car, and we're going to pass in a vector of true and false. So if we were to run that, what we're going to get here is a column which has a checkbox. If we check this, it's going to be a true, and if we uncheck, it's going to be a false. So if we check this here, check this and then uncheck it, and then check this here, and we click on synchronize and click on done, the problem here is we see a bunch of NA values. So if it's empty, it doesn't necessarily mean it's false. It's going to set it to NA. The only time it becomes a false is if we check the box and then uncheck it. That's when it's set to false. So just be aware of that. Last column option is a password. So let's say you want to create a column, but you don't want the values to be seen on the end user side. So what you could do is you can actually do that by passing in the password parameter into the secret column basically. So let's go ahead and create a new column called secret column. And we're going to pass it into the column options where we set the secret column to password. If we were to run this, we're going to go ahead and, for example, type in anything in here. So you're going to notice that you see a bunch of asterisks. So it's more of like in a password format. If we synchronize this and run this, do keep in mind that the values will be seen on the dataset. So this is more of an end user thing. It's not going to carry over into the dataset. You can stretch the columns. You can stretch the columns by default on your dataset. So let's say you just don't like how your columns look. So let's say this is by default, the column stretch parameter is set to false. You get these columns that are, pretty small in width, but if you set the call stretch equal to true, and if you were to run this, what you will get is you're going to see your columns stretched out. Now let's go ahead and see how we can convert the categorical columns to factors. Now by default, when you load in a data set and it has strings, it's going to automatically consider them as strings. It's not really going to consider them as a factor, but you can actually set that differently. So for this example, we're going to go ahead and create a new column called car name in our car dataset. So we're going to create a duplicate of the empty cars and store it in empty cars2. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create a new column in our new dataset empty cars2 and call it car name, where we're going to set it equal to the row names of empty cars2. And now what we want to do is we want to load in our dataset with our new dataset, and we want to set the call factor parameter equal to true. And then we want to check the structure of this package of the dataset. So if we were to run this and we look at our data, you can notice that we do have the extra column in there. If we click on done, you're going to notice that the car name, well, we actually do have to synchronize this. So if we were to run this and we click on the synchronize button and then click on done, we're going to notice that the car name actually has a factor with 32 levels, because each car name is a unique value. Okay, moving on to the next parameter is the call names parameter. Now let's say you don't want your user to edit the header of a specific column or a specific set of columns. You can do so by using the call names parameter. Now let's say you set it equal to MPG. What this means is you do not want the user to edit the MPG header column. So if we were to run that and you try to edit the MPG column and you set it to something else, for example, you type in a bunch of things, you're going to notice that it did reset to its original section, and actually did give a message in here that says MPG columns are read-only and cannot be edited. You can do the same if you wanted to prevent the editing of multiple columns by simply passing in a vector. So let's say we want to prevent them from editing MPG and also the cylinder column. And if we were to run this and we try to edit the MPG, it resets. And if we try to edit the cylinder, it resets. But then if you try to edit this, for example, it edits just fine and it retains. Now let's say you don't want to edit a column, or you want to prevent a user from editing a column. So that's when you use the call read only parameter. Now in this case, it works the same way as a call names, where you pass in the name of the column that you do not want the user to edit. So in this case, it's the cylinder. So if we were to run that and we want to click on the cylinder, and let's say we want to change the value here to 456, and if we were to run that, it actually resets back to the way it was. Okay, another thing you can do is you can add rows to your data. So this is very similar to the callbind parameter, but in this case, we're working with rows. We're going to do so by using the rowbind parameter and setting it equal to a list. The list takes a row, and you can set the row equal to a value. So in this case, I'm setting the last row to equal to 0. So if we were to run this and we scroll all the way to the bottom, we're going to notice that it actually appended the row. The only problem here is that you can't really specify a row name for this. So whatever you pass in the row name, it's not going to reflect, it's just going to use the row number as that row name. So that's just one of the downsides of it. Next, you can also prevent the user from editing, from adding specific rows, adding or removing rows, by passing in the row edit parameter. So by default, this is set to true, but if we were to set it equal to false and run it, and if we try to right click, you're going to notice that we no longer see the remove or add or insert row. So that's an interesting thing as well. So if you want to prevent them from adding or removing rows, this would be your parameter to use. Now, of course, if you were to make changes into your data set, of course, you'd want to save all these changes. You can actually save them directly to a file. So what this does is it will make the changes, whatever changes you make to the data set, it will save it to a file called emptycars_edit.csv, and it's going to save it in your working directory. So if you were to run this, and let's say we make a couple of changes, so let's say I want to go ahead and select just a couple of rows over here, and let's say I want to delete them. So let's say I do want to select these, and then I want to remove the rows, And let's say I want to take all of these and just copy them over here like that. And then just copy these and then just select all of these and just actually copy them like this. And let's say I want to call this miles. And let's say I just want to delete this column over here. So let's say we want to remove this column. So you can click on synchronize. And then if you click on done and you go to your working directory, so let's say we go to our working directory in the DataEditR files, you're going to notice that we see the empty cars edit file. And if we were to open that up, you're going to notice that the changes have been reflected. So just give it a second as it loads up. And as you notice, you're going to see the changes have been reflected with the removed rows and adjusted column header, and also the deleted column is not there. Pretty cool. Okay. Now, one of the things you could do with your window is you can actually edit the appearance of your window. So if we were to look at our window when we load in the data edit function, what we can do is we can see that we have a title on the top and an image. So what we can do is we can actually perform edits to this. We can change the title, and then we can also change the logo. Now, if we wanted to set the title, all you need to do is pass in the title parameter and set it equal to whatever title you want it to be. So if we were to run this, you're going to notice that now we have a new title called DataEditR window. Let's say you wanted to add your own image. You can do so. This file right here links to the R logo image. So I'm just going to go ahead and run this image file object, which contains a link to the R logo. And what you do is you pass in the logo parameter and you set it equal to whatever your image is. So if we were to run that, you're going to notice that we do have the R logo. Now by default, the logo is set to 30 pixels, but you can actually readjust this to maybe, let's say you want to do 60. And if you were to run this, you're going to notice that the logo is significantly larger. You can also move the location of the logo, but you only have two positions to pick from, left or right. The default is left, so let's say we switch it to right and we click on run. You notice that it switches to the right. You can actually resize the viewer window by default. So let's say you wanted to make it larger when you open it up. The default height is 800 and the default width is 1200. So let's say you want to switch this to 1200 and then switch the width to 2000. And if we were to run that, you're going to notice that the dimensions are different. You can actually change the theme of your window, and the themes are based on the R Shiny themes. So by default, it uses the Yeti theme, but you can find a whole list of themes from the Shiny Themes website. So if we were to load this into our web browser and go into the themes, here's a list of themes that you could use. So let's say I want to use the Cyborg theme. So you can actually pass that in here. Now keep in mind, you need to use all lowercase letters. So if we were to pass in Cyborg and run the function, you're going to notice that we get that Cyborg effect over here. Now, of course, this is not necessarily a great theme because you can look at the text and it's very dim because the text is white and then the backdrop is also white in the cell, so it doesn't really help. So let's pick another theme. Let's go ahead and check, for example, we can check, let's say superhero, for example. Let's go ahead and check superhero. So let's type that in, superhero, and then you can just run that. And this is also pretty dim, so let's go ahead and find another one. Let's try United. And that was one that I saw. So let's go ahead and check that out. Okay, there we go. So this one actually works out just fine. So that's another issue with the themes as well, is maybe there could be a fix that makes the themes, you know, display the text properly as opposed to making it blend in with the backdrop of the cells. So let's just go ahead and escape out of this. Okay. Now, this is a part that I want to get into. We can only work with CSV files as of now. By default, it uses the read.csv function to read the data, and it uses the write.csv function to write the data. But let's say you have an Excel spreadsheet that you want to work with. Well, you can actually do so. Now, all you're going to need to do is you first need to set the save as parameter equal to whatever you want to name your file. So this is the file that we want to name, empty cars edited excel.xlsx. And we want to use the read function and set it equal to read.xlsx. Now, of course, before we can do any of this, we do need to load in the XLS package by typing in library XLSX. And if you don't have this package, you can go ahead and install it first before loading it in. So this function will allow you to work with Excel files by just editing them, reading them, and writing them. So back to where I was, you'll have to use the read function parameter and then set it equal to read.xlsx. This is the function used to read the Excel files. And then these are some arguments that we're passing into our data. So what we want to do is we want to read the first 20 rows of our data. So we can set the list start row equals to 1, end row equals to 21, and then the sheet index equals to 1. Now for this one, you do have to set the sheet index. That is a must, or it could be a sheet name. Otherwise, this will not work. But essentially what the read args parameter does is it allows you to load in the parameters that you would load into the read.xlsx function if you were to use this regularly. So if I were to use the read.xlsx function, you're going to notice that I can actually pass in some of these parameters, like for example start row, and then you can also use, for example, end row, and then you can also use the sheet index. So basically the read args allows you to load in those parameters to that function. And then you can actually you must set the write function parameter to be equal to write.xlsx, so be sure that's set properly. And then you want to set the write args function and pass in those parameters if you need to make some changes. So in this case, I do want to set the row.names parameter equals to true. I want to give this file a password so that the user has to insert a password before using this file, and I want to call the sheet name and rename it cards. So this is the syntax that you would use to read a different type of file. Now I'm pretty sure you can try and use different file types to try and read in the data with their appropriate functions, and it should work. This hasn't really given me any issues over here. So if we were to run this, and let's say we were to maybe we're just going to keep it the way it is. As you can see, it only selected the first 20 rows as we intended. So I'm just going to go ahead and synchronize and click on done. And if we go back to our directory here, we're going to notice that we have an empty cars edited Excel file. If we were to click on that, we're going to notice that it asks us for a password. So we're just going to type in the password, test123. It's going to load up our data set for us. It includes the row names as we specified, and it also renamed the sheet to cars. Perfect. Now these last three parameters are not really important. I think they're pretty redundant. The quiet mode will just suppress some messages that you have in the background. Now I have used this function, and what it does is there are just some messages that might pop up after you make some edits. However, it doesn't necessarily suppress all the messages. You'll still get some warning messages. So I personally don't think this is an effective parameter just yet. This is another parameter called hide. What this does is it will hide the buttons on your window. So let's say you want to set this equals to true, and if we run this, you're going to notice that we don't see those buttons that we were seeing anymore. So I guess this could be useful for someone that just doesn't want to work with the buttons. That could be useful. And then last but not least, this is a pretty interesting parameter. I think this can be improved a lot, but I think it's pretty interesting. It's basically a parameter that can store the code used to edit your file. So basically what it does is it kind of records the actions you're taking to edit the file, kind of like a macro in VBA. And then it will show you the code used to generate the edits made to the file. And what we're doing here is we're using the code parameter and setting it equal to an R script. Now keep in mind this R script is not created for us. And what it's going to do is it's just going to go ahead and create that R script for us and store that code in the R file. So if we were to run this, and let's say we make a bunch of changes to this. So let's say we, for example, delete this column, and let's say we highlight a bunch of rows in here, and we just remove these rows, change the header over here to miles, change this to cylinder, change this to, for example, cool car, and then synchronize the changes and click on done. What we're going to notice is if we go into our working directory, we're going to find a new script called the code, which is what we specified the name to be. But the thing is it hard codes the changes. So it's not necessarily steps showing you the changes made to the code. It would be cool to see some kind of deep layer steps that were shown to change your code. But at the same time, it's just showing things hard coded. It's not very effective. However, if you were to run this, so let's say we call this, for example, test data. And if you were to run this, it's actually going to create that same data set we have with all the edits. So I guess it's not really effectively showing you the steps of code, but it's just kind of just generating a data set for you that's based on your edits. So overall, that concludes the review of this package. I think it's a great package with a lot of potential. It's something that a lot of us can use in terms of editing specific cells or editing column headers, but I think it needs a lot of work done in order for it to be perfect. But hopefully we can see that in the foreseeable future, and maybe we can make another video about that, reviewing the package with all its refined changes. But regardless, thank you so much for the work, Dylan. This is a fantastic package with a lot of promise, and I think this is exactly something that I've been looking for, because sometimes I've been in those instances where I wanted to edit a specific cell without having to get to it by code. So this seems like a much easier way to go about it. So anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you learned a lot from this package. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.